see no cuts under this last year's legislative budget. Actually, may even be in the black into the positive this year through some really technical and boring legislative language that we put into the budget that allows them to draw down more federal dollars, more matching federal dollars. So that was another accomplishment for Dade County. Port of Miami. How many are familiar with the dredging project in the Port of Miami? Whether you're for it or against it, it had been approved and it was determined to be something that was important for this community. I was in favor of it because I do see the positives that come along with dredging the port and making our port a competitor with other ports along the east coast, the entire east coast of the United States, let alone our own state. We'll be the first port to be able to dredge and to be able to receive the post-Panamax ships that will be going through the Panama Canal from the Pacific Ocean, these wider, deeper dredging ships, and we wanted to be in a position to receive those ships here in our port because actually we get a lot of cargo in Miami-Dade County. A lot of people don't realize just how much cargo comes through Miami-Dade County to go to the rest of the country. And we wanted to be in a position to receive that. There was a hiccup in the permitting process, so we were able to get some language into a transportation bill this year that allowed the county to move forward in that project, and we were very proud about accomplishing that. Especially since last legislative session, there were $75 million added to the state budget to pay for that dredging project because the federal government, we had asked the federal government to at least match the dollars, and they failed to do so in their funding. So the state stepped up to the plate and paid for the entire project, $150 million, to dredge the Port of Miami, so that we would be ready in time by 2014 to compete for those ships. And if we hadn't gotten that additional permitting language into the legislation this past year, we would have missed that 2014 deadline. It wouldn't have made any sense to dredge at all, because if we would have missed the deadline, we wouldn't have been able to compete with other ports that would be ready in time to receive those ships. So luckily we were able to get that in there, and the project will be moving forward. I believe they've already let the contract out for bid, and I look forward to seeing that work get done. Another accomplishment this year, the Marlin Stadium. A lot of you know what happened there. The current property appraiser decided to impose a taxable value on the garages next to the stadium, next to the new Marlin Stadium. I was not in favor of that. I didn't believe it was fair to impose a new tax on the city of Miami, because at the end of the day, if that tax would have been imposed, the city of Miami was going to have to pay that tax. And a third of that tax that they'd be paying would go back to themselves. It just didn't make any sense. And the city of Miami, if they have to pay a tax, it's not the city that's going to pay a tax. The city doesn't have any income. It doesn't go out and have a job at McDonald's. It gets its money from its taxpayers through property taxes. So it would be an additional burden on a city that was already up to here with its costs and teetering on the brink of insolvency. So I sponsored language in a bill that exempted those garages from taxation. We were glad and happy that that passed, and that tax will now not be imposed on the city of Miami. And so that was another accomplishment this legislative session. Throughout my career, I want to talk also about some of the other things I accomplished in my career in Tallahassee. It's my 8th year as a legislator. A lot of people tell me I don't look old enough to be a legislator now, let alone having served for the past 8 years. But I have been a legislator for the past 8 years. I was elected in 2004. And in my first term in the legislature, one of my proudest accomplishments of my entire legislative career was a question that was on the ballot in 2006, and it was a question to double the homestead exemption for low-income seniors. That was very important to me because I bought tens of thousands of homes in my two elections, my election in 2002 that I lost and my election in 2004 that I won. And more than any other issue that I heard when I was walking door to door was property taxes, property taxes. How do we lower property taxes? Can you lower my property taxes? Also heard about insurance, but insurance is a tough issue to deal with because you're dealing with private entities and private industry. Property taxes is a entirely government-run process. So it is very easy for the state to involve itself in the issue of property taxes. So in 2006, I was proud to be the sponsor of the constitutional amendment that doubled the homestead exemption for low-income seniors. It was the last time that seniors received a targeted tax break. These past 2 years in the legislature, we actually had members file a third homestead exemption for low-income seniors. We did pass it this last year, and it will be on the ballot in November. There'll be a third homestead exemption for low-income seniors on the ballot this November. We also tried to pass legislation to the legislature to freeze property taxes for seniors, for low-income seniors. It passed the last 2 years out of the Florida House. Unfortunately, it didn't get anywhere in the Florida Senate, and I could spend a whole day talking about frustrations with bills that we pass in the House that don't go anywhere in the Florida Senate. Another piece of legislation that I was proud of in my career was mortgage fraud. I passed, and now is now law, the toughest penalties for mortgage fraud that in the history of the state of Florida. It's now a second-degree felony for anybody involved in mortgage fraud, from the bank, the banker, the bank representative, the mortgage broker, all the way down to the appraiser. Anyone involved in mortgage fraud will now be guilty of a second-degree felony if they had anything to do with any type of mortgage fraud. Now, that came as a result of my participation in the mortgage fraud task force that was working for the last few years. Another bill that I worked on has to do with, and it really doesn't have a lot to do with your pocketbook, but it has to do with an issue that I'm sure a lot of you have seen and been frustrated with. High-speed motorcycles on the expressway. How many of you have been on the expressway and had these motorcycles, groups of motorcycles speed past you? Happened to me. I was, it's funny, I was just on a weekend driving on I-95 with my wife, and a band of these motorcycles came by doing wheelies and stunts, and they had a minivan chasing them and filming them from inside the van, and I thought to myself, man, we should do something about that. I wish somebody would do something about that. And I said to myself, wait, I can do something about that. So I did. So in 2007, I passed a law, and it wasn't easy, because you'd be surprised how passionate these motorcyclists are. I mean, I got as far as death threats against me on pushing for this motorcycle legislation, but we persevered and we passed it. And what it said was, if you do a wheelie, or if you go 50 miles an hour over the speed limit on any road, or you do any kind of stunts, standing on your bike, if you're not sitting, you're going to have a $1,000 fine. Second offense, $2,500 fine.
That's not
Third
just
offense.
motorcycles.
Well, the speed applies to anything that actually, any vehicle on the road, but the stunting applies obviously to motorcycles, because I've never seen a car pull a wheelie. That makes sense. But the third offense is a $10,000 fine. These are the toughest fines of any state in the entire country. And we've actually participated in several stings with the Florida Highway Patrol. Right at actually in this neighborhood, right where the Palmetto Expressway ends, about 104th Street, that restaurant that used to be Fuddruckers is a hangout of these motorcycle groups on Thursday nights. And we've done several stings in that area. Actually, the first ticket written under this law, I was surprised, because during the process of passing this bill, I was, arguing with the motorcycle groups, and I wanted it to apply only to motorcycles. And they were saying, well, should the speed portion should apply to cars too? And I didn't think any cars went that fast, because I see the motorcycles, they go at such fast speeds, and they can accelerate faster than any car that's on the road. But ironically, at the end of the day, we put cars into the bill as well. And the first ticket written in the state of Florida under this law was a Mustang doing 120 miles per hour on the Palmetto Expressway. So it was an irony, and as soon as they wrote that ticket, I called the gentleman who was pushing for the motorcycle groups in Tallahassee, and I called him and left him a message to say, you were right, I was wrong. The first ticket written was a car. So that was another bill that we were proud to pass. A couple of other pieces of legislation that I've passed, or had a hand in putting the amendment on the bill. There was one bill that I sponsored in 2008 legislative session, which dealt with highest and best use on the valuation of your property. This was during the boom times. And a lot of people were coming, and we had a lot of forums, a lot of public hearings on property taxes, and we were hearing a lot from commercial property owners or non-homestead property owners, specifically apartment buildings, small apartment buildings, people who owned a 6 to 12, 20 unit apartment building, who were complaining that because the zoning in their particular area or their property allowed for one of these 100, 150, 200 unit condo buildings, they were being assessed at that higher value, because the law said you can assess at the highest and best use. In Miami-Dade County, they were taking advantage of it to keep revenues high and values high. They were assessing every property they could at the highest and best use, and I didn't think that was fair, because I didn't think that it was fair that government should take advantage of your property, an advantage that you are not even taking advantage of, but they can because of what could potentially be there. So we were successful in putting language in law that said you cannot assess at the highest and best use unless you have pulled all the permits, gotten all the zoning, and done everything necessary to use that higher use, because it's just not fair. At least it wasn't in my opinion. Also successful in extending, there's a specific program that's unique to Dade County, which is a surtax program for funding affordable housing. That program was set to expire in 2011. That law was going to sunset, and dock stamps for commercial properties were going to go up 10 cents, and that money would all go to the state of Florida. Because right now, if you pay dock stamps on a commercial transaction, a portion of that money stays here in Dade County and goes directly to an affordable housing fund just for Dade County. Now, you can argue about how the fund is spent and how those dollars are spent by the county, and that's another argument to be had. But it was important, I thought, to maintain those dollars here in Miami-Dade County, because having been in the legislature for many years, I know that when you're trying to wrestle with other legislators from around the state about funding for Dade County, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. And though we are the largest county, we are always outnumbered on the floor of the House and the Senate, because the rest of the state put together is larger than this delegation, even though, we are the largest delegation. So that was another one of the pieces of legislation that I was proud to sponsor and pass. And now that program will be extended to 2031. So maybe one of our children or grandchildren will be the sponsor of extending that to 2051. I don't know, but definitely it'll be in place till 2031. Another piece of legislation that I was very proud of was, how many of you have ever appealed your property value to the Value Adjustment Board? Okay. Any in the last 3 years? Well, 3 years ago, I sponsored and passed legislation to make it easier. Because before 3 years ago, if you appealed that value, you went in with both hands tied behind your back, because the property appraiser was presumed correct. He had the presumption of correctness in any appeal that before the Value Adjustment Board. I switched that. I changed it around, and I said the property appraiser shall not have the presumption of correctness. The property appraiser shall prove with a preponderance of the evidence that he is correct. So I took away the presumption of correctness from the property appraiser, so that at least you went in with equal footing when you were appealing your valuation. Because it was a losing battle, I thought, for property owners when they were appealing their values. So now it's a little easier, and actually I recommend to everybody this year to appeal your values. If you have a non-homesteaded property in Florida, appeal your value this year. Because in November, there's a question that we put on the ballot, a constitutional amendment, that will cap all non-homesteaded property at 5%. Right now, everybody who has a homestead exemption has a 3% cap. Everybody's familiar with that 3% cap. If this question is approved by the voters in November, everything else will have a 5% cap. So I'm recommending to everybody to appeal their values this year. Why? Because if you are successful and you lower your value, which I believe values in Dade County are unfair, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, but if you are successful, then that'll be your new baseline for that 5% cap. As it goes forward, it will only increase 5% per year on your taxable value. So I'm recommending to everybody this year to appeal your values, and hopefully you'll be successful in that regard. I think that's about it. I want to talk a little bit about what I'm going to be doing next, and then I'll open it up to questions. I probably talked a little bit longer than I should have. I'm actually, because of my record in Tallahassee and the years that I spent on this property tax issue and property value issue, and having to deal with this Marlins Stadium garage issue this past year, I had to look into decisions that were made at the property appraiser's office. And actually, I sponsored twice a constitutional amendment to make the property appraiser in Dade County an elected position, because we were the last elected property appraiser. This county was the last county in Florida to have an elected property appraiser. So I always thought it was important to have an elected property appraiser. I just never thought that I would run for it. But because of this year having to deal with that garage issue and having to solve that problem from Tallahassee when it could have been solved locally by virtue of the power that the property appraiser holds as a constitutional officer, he could have individually said, we will not impose this value, this is a new tax. If you don't like it, the courts are at your disposal. But he didn't. He chose to protect government revenue rather than protect the taxpayers. And other decisions that I've learned about have made me unhappy about what's happening in that office. First of all, how many of you know what a foreclosure is? Everybody knows what a foreclosure is. Did you know that the property appraiser doesn't include them in the valuation of your homes or your properties? It's not included. And I don't think that's fair, because everybody here, and stop me if you disagree, but everybody here I think would agree that a foreclosure affects market value, that foreclosures have affected market value. And in my opinion, if it affects market value, why shouldn't it affect your taxable value? Of course it should. But the current property appraiser doesn't think so. There have been a record number of appeals in Dade County, more so than any other county in the state. And that's not really the most important thing. The most important thing is those appeals, those record number of appeals are upheld, and value reductions are granted to over half of them, which means that of the 143,000 people that appealed their valuation in 2009, 54% of them were granted a reduction. 54%. The same year in Broward, only 8% of their appeals were granted. In the same year in Hillsborough, only 4% of their appeals were granted. Yet in Dade County, 54% of the appeals were granted. That just tells me that there's something wrong with the valuations that are coming out of that office. And those appeals amount to $8 billion in value that year that were reduced from the tax rules. That translates to $160 million in property taxes. And to put that in context, the mayor, Carlos Lopez, was recalled for $174 million property tax increase. And we have faulty valuations that are costing people, just the people who appealed, $160 million. What if the rest had appealed? How overinflated were those values? So I have nothing against the current property appraiser as a person. I think he's an honorable man. I just think we have a difference of philosophies and opinions. I think that I could run that office better because it's had the largest budget increase of any property appraiser's office in the state of Florida over the last 3 years. It is 371 employees and $33 million budget. They have the largest budget of any property appraiser, and if you do the math and you divide the number of properties that they appraise by their budget per parcel, they do it for 30% more than any other property appraiser in the state. That's how much it costs per parcel. So there are definitely efficiencies that need to be had in that office, because those savings I would hope would be passed on to the taxpayer. I definitely don't think that the valuations that are coming out of that office are fair. I definitely don't think that the decisions being made by the leader of that office are on behalf of the property owner and the taxpayers. I believe that they are on behalf of government. So those are the things that I would change, and I'm running for property appraiser this year because of those things. I feel it's very important. It's not the logical step for somebody who's served as majority leader of the Florida House. You know, some of my predecessors are congressmen. One of my predecessors is Marco Rubio. He was majority leader of the Florida House, and he's a United States senator. So it's definitely not a logical step to run for property appraiser, but I'm doing it because I didn't think anybody else would, and I'm doing it because I thought it needed to be done, and that's why I'm running for this position. So I'm happy to answer any questions about the legislature, about the property appraisal system, about my campaign, and I thank you all for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, sir.
What about commercial property appeals?
I'm sorry?
Commercial property appeals, because commercial property rentals have dropped seriously, but the valuations stay high.
Agreed.
And the cost of insurance and property taxes outweigh the rent you recover.
Well, that's a very good question. And I'll tell you this, and I have confirmed this through several property appeal professionals. That law that I told you I passed for those specific properties on the highest and best use is not being respected in the valuations in Miami-Dade County. So you can put a lot of, this is another lesson that I learned in the legislature. You can put a law in the book, but unless you put penalties for not adhering to it, a lot of people just don't follow it.
Because they're increasing their workload. I'm in the process of asking for it. They're asking for 2 and 3 years of tax returns. And they don't have anybody in their office that can evaluate tax returns.
Right. No, I agree.
And they're just faltering on getting it done. So you lose money as you own properties.
Are you familiar with the income approach valuation of property?
I am, but they're not doing it that way. I appealed on that basis they ask for more tax returns, which means they're going to sit down.
That's unfortunate. Well, I can tell you this, I would change that culture in there. I would. I would make sure that the laws, just even the laws that I passed, that I wrote, would be respected and adhered to. And this would be new. This would be breaking new ground for Miami-Dade County because, in my opinion, that office has been preoccupied with how the values would translate into revenue and property taxes. And in my opinion, my belief is that the property appraiser should be blind to revenue. The decisions that come out of that office should never be determined based on how it will affect revenue for Miami-Dade County or the property tax rolls. It should be based on what is the fair and just value of your property. So I don't believe that's been happening. I definitely don't think it happened when we had an appointed property appraiser. I don't think it's happened since we had an elected property appraiser because you know what? The last appointed property appraiser that was appointed by the county manager is a gentleman by the name of Marcus Sykes. That gentleman is the deputy property appraiser under the current property appraiser, Pedro Garcia. And that's why nothing has changed, because the person who is running the office is the deputy property appraiser, and he's continuing the same policies from before. I wanted more when I voted to create an elected property appraiser, and that's why I'm running, because I don't think we're getting what we deserve. Yes, sir.
Kind of dealing just with elections
Yes, sir.
In general. Out of curiosity, I was wondering, what's your position on the issue dealing with Governor Scott and the voter roll initiative that he's doing?
Yes. Well, I think that anybody who votes should have all the legal abilities to vote. I believe that if the non-citizen purge is appropriate, I just think the timing is probably not the best. But I do think that if there are non-citizens, people who don't have the right to vote, voting, even one, then yeah, we should ferret them out, because that the most sacred thing that we possess as citizens of the United States of America is our ability to vote and to elect our leaders. And keeping that process pure is very important, I think. I think that the timing is just looks bad because it's being reported like it's some sort of plot to remove people from the rolls coming up to, approaching these elections. But I do think it is appropriate to keep our voting rolls cleansed and pure, and to ensure that only the people who have the right to vote are voting. Yes, sir.
Carlos, the question I have is, obviously it's great to reduce taxes, but knowing what the real estate taxes serve as purpose, how do we replace the revenue, assuming we're able to reduce taxes under your election significantly? What effect will that have on services, schools, and so on? And how do we make up for that shortfall, assuming that we're able to successfully reduce the taxes, both for homestead and non-homestead properties?
Okay, that's a very good question. I get it asked a lot. I'm not proposing, and I'm not running on a platform of reducing taxes. I'm running on a platform of giving you what I think is a fair value for your property, which I don't think you're getting right now. There's two answers to that question. First of all, like I said, the property appraiser should never, ever, ever even let the issue of revenue come into his mind, because the moment that the property appraiser starts thinking about revenue and how the valuations will affect revenue, then it will taint, I believe, the decision and the values that the owners are getting. The property appraiser's job is to be blind to revenue. That's the job of the commission, the city, county commission, to create the millage rate, that is the percentage that you pay in taxes. The property appraiser's job is to give you a fair value. The job of revenue and millage is a commission. That's their job to decide when they set the millage rate. So I think that's a function of the county commission to worry about. It shouldn't be an issue for the property appraiser. Now, that being said, there's a huge amount of homestead exemption fraud in this community, this county, to the tune of, I believe, over $150 million. I've seen proposals of companies that have made proposals to the current property appraiser where they say, we believe that there's, of the 425,000 homesteaded properties in Dade County, potentially 5% of them are fraudulent, because these companies have been doing it for decades. They've been doing this type of work for decades, and their track record shows, on average, 5% of homestead exemptions are fraudulent. Others think that it's actually higher in Dade County. So an aggressive homestead exemption fraud program would definitely bring in revenue that is supposed to be paid. You know, people who are avoiding their taxes. I'm not for new taxes. I'm not for increasing taxes. I never have been. But I am for people paying the tax that they're supposed to pay. I don't believe that anybody should cheat their way out of paying taxes, because that ends up costing everybody who's honest more money. So an aggressive homestead exemption fraud program, which I think there's common sense ways to address that, which are not being used today. I know I'm sorry, I'm going a little over, but I'll be very quick. There's two common sense things that I would do. First of all, share information with the realtors. Is anybody here a realtor? Anybody here know what the MLS is?
Oh, yeah.
Everybody knows what the MLS is. Do you know that the current property appraiser doesn't share that information with the realtors to identify homestead exemption fraud via rental listings on the MLS? That's a very simple and easy way to identify homestead exemption fraud, not doing it. A second way to do it, take the homestead exemption rolls, send it to FPL, and tell them, don't ask them for their information, give them our information, which is already a public record, and say, please cross-reference this with your utility bills. If they don't match, there's something going on, because everybody here knows that a renter may or may not pay the water bill, but the renter always pays the electric bill. The landlord never pays the electric bill. So if the landlord is gaining a homestead exemption, he's renting it out, you know that the person renting it is paying that electric bill. You send the homestead rolls to the FPL. I've already spoken to them. They're intrigued by the idea. It would probably not take more than a couple hours for them to cross-reference it and send it back and say, hey, these are the ones that don't match. And that's another way to identify it, and it's free. Yet he just signed a multi-million-dollar contract to try and identify homestead exemption fraud. So those are the types of things that you could do also to recapture revenue that is, illegally being and fraudulently being taken away. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I recently heard the mayor of Miami at a Chamber South meeting, and they were touting the budget cuts, and I know that a lot of people are upset because it affected the employees. You're talking about the $33 million budget for the appraiser's office. Why didn't that get some review when he did these kind of budget cuts?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I brought it up at a forum that he and I were both speaking at last week. It was last week or the week before, a couple of weeks ago. And I brought up the issue of the bloated budget in that office. And his response was, oh, well, we had to do that because the Department of Revenue made us do it, which is not true. I don't know. I can't speak to that because it's very hard to get information out of that office to find out what specifically the money is being spent on. I can tell you that of all the property appraisers in the state of Florida, he has the most employees of any of them. There's 371 people working in that office. The highest budget of any property appraiser's office in Florida, and on a per parcel price of appraisal, we are 30% higher than our next door neighbor, which is Broward County. And they can do appraisals for like $25, $26 per parcel. We're doing it for like $33 a parcel here in Dade County. So if you go into the office, at least cognizant of that, and respecting of the people's money that goes to pay for that office, the efficiencies can be had. It's just a matter of the leadership that is there and their philosophy and their management abilities. So if elected in August, and the election's on August 14th, that would be one of my top priorities, is to reduce it. And more so and also to make things easier for the public to deal with that office. I want to hang a banner in the front of that office that says, welcome, how can we help you? Because I've been in that office, and I can tell you, I was there a couple weeks ago, and I asked a simple question. It's 2012, I'd like to know the value of my property for 2012, because your preliminary tax rolls are already certified, so I want to know what my value is. The girl at the front desk told me, no, I can't give that to you. I said, why? She says, well, it's because of the law. It's the law. And I know it's not the law. And I said, for the person who deals with the public to not even know a simple answer like that when dealing with the public, what else is going on? What other things how other How many other people have had that type of interaction? And because they don't know better, they think that what they're being told is, what they're being told is the truth. So that's another thing that I'd like to change, is how the office interacts with the public.
Carlos?
Thank you.
Thank you.